Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament. We are looking at the Gospels and the 250 events in the life of Jesus, and we're doing this in chronological order, looking through it through the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And right now, we're still in the Sermon on the Mount, and this is going to take us a couple weeks, and it's going from Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7. Today we are hitting on Matthew 5:31 and 32, two short verses, but in these short verses there is a lot, and I think we all know, and this is Jesus talking about a divorce, and I think we all know that this is something that has hit all of our families. I mean, you'd have to be living under a rock or out in the middle of nowhere for divorce not to have some sort of impact in you in some way. And so it's a hard subject. It can be a controversial subject to talk about. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to do like I have with everything else, is approach it from a pure biblical standpoint, but also not just a narrow, hey, I'm grabbing these two verses, but I want to look at it in the entire context of the Bible and what the writer and what Jesus in this instance is saying. And later on, we're going to actually sit down and do a deeper study through marriage and divorce. But I want to just kind of hit some points on this today and look at it is it's not as, sometimes the church has made this a pretty cut and dry issue, and I don't think it's as cut as dry as it is, because it's a very complicated issue. Jesus tried to shore it up here a little bit and make it a little bit more cut and dry than what the Pharisees had done here, and for sure, right? And so if we look at what we looked at yesterday, Jesus talks about adultery first, right? He's talking about adultery and lust, and he says, and I'm going back a little bit at verse 27. He says, you have Curtis said, you must not commit adultery, right? Because later on he's going to talk about adultery being a legitimate concern or reason for divorce. But he says, I say, anyone, even if anyone looks at a woman with lust, has committed adultery with her in her heart. And again, like we talked about yesterday, this is more than just, oh, well, I think that guy's good looking or that girl's good looking. It is a desire to go after to, and you think about it a lot, and you think about, like, it's going into a where it becomes a sinful act of thinking. And this is the thing that Jesus is talking about with a lot of this stuff is, the sin doesn't start with the physical act. The sin starts in the mind. It starts with what you're thinking about. And so the adultery starts with, he says you're committing adultery in your heart the minute you start thinking about doing that with someone else, right? And so then he goes into, okay, let's look at divorce. And so verse 31, he says, you have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce, right? And this was done for, and we'll look at this later on, but this wasn't the original intent, and that's what Jesus is getting at here. He says, but I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. Now, that's a hard thing to look at, and that's maybe a hard thing for some people to accept. But if we look at what Jesus is saying here, the only legitimate reason for divorce from in this stance is sexual immorality, right? The Greek word that's used here is, um, my mind just went blank. Sorry, is porneia, which we get our word pornography from, right? And it's sexual immorality. And so that's what Jesus said. And the reason he's going this far with it is because the Pharisees and a lot of the Jewish leaders had basically gotten to the point where if they just didn't like their wife, or didn't, you know, she burnt done dinner. I mean, literally, if just for whatever reason, they could just hand her a certificate of divorce. And so Jesus was doing like he had done with all the other things, saying, hey, look, you said this, but I'm saying this now, right? This is what God truly intended, and God truly intended for people to not get divorced. And so he's saying, look, unless it's for sexual immorality. Now, I think there's a lot of things that fall under sexual immorality. One of the questions that was asked in our group today was about pornography, and I think now I don't know if I want to say watching pornography one time falls under there, but if someone is actively watching pornography, I think that falls under sexual morality, and I think that falls under a reason for divorcing. Now, some people may disagree with me on that, but I, you know, unfortunately, we've seemed to have come up with more and more creative ways to be sexually immoral as we've progressed in this world. And so, um, I just want you to think about that as we go through it. But there's some other things I want you to understand in this as well, because, one of the things we're going to look at is, and we're going to look at divorce more, and I want you to be thinking about this. Don't just take it for what I say here, but I want you to study it and think about it, right? Because also the taught or the thing that's been taught is, well, if someone does divorce except for this reason and they get remarried, well, then they're living in a constant state of adultery. Well, that's not what the Bible says here. And when we need to be careful with how we look at this, and I'm not going to go deep into all the Greek verb tenses and meanings and stuff like that. But if you look at what it says, is it says it causes them to commit adultery, right? But if you also look, he also says anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. It doesn't say that they stay in the constant state of adultery, and he actually recognizes the new marriage as a marriage. He calls it a marriage. And so what we've got to say is that it's that initial act of, consummating the marriage is the adultery, that initial kickoff. And then now that new marriage is a marriage. And so there's a lot of people, we got to be careful with this, because there's a lot of people who say, well, if someone commits adultery or gets divorced and commits adultery, but then they become Christians again or become Christians, well, then they have to divorce the people that they're with and get back with the people that they're married beforehand. And then now you're just creating more divorces and more adultery. And so we've got to be careful. And I know this is going to be hard for some people to maybe grasp, because I think it's been taught differently, because I think really we've been taught two different ways about divorces. There's abandonment, which Paul talks about, right? And then there's sexual immorality, which Jesus talks about. And those really two are the only two that really kind of fall under. Now, I think there's things that fall under sexual immorality, sexual abuse. I think there's things that fall under abandonment, such as, abuse, physical abuse, and things like that. I think that falls under the idea of abandonment, which Paul was talking about. Now, some people may disagree with me here, but the one thing I will say is, if someone does get a divorce, right, and it's not what we would consider, what Jesus would consider a biblical divorce, and they do get remarried, right, that marriage in itself is not in a constant state of adultery. And that's what we need to understand. And it is something that can be forgiven, right? If those two people ask for forgiveness, say they become Christians, or, come back to God, and they ask for forgiveness, then that can be forgiven, and they don't need to split up for it. And that's what we've got to look at, because we don't want to, in the act of trying to get to this too much, we don't want to end up causing more sin, because we think that we got to make the first sin right. When we ask for forgiveness, the sin's forgiven, and we can move on. Now, if you get a divorce because you just, you're tired of your spouse or whatever, and your intent is, well, I can find someone else and God will forgive me, you're walking a fine line there. I don't think I would do that. Well, you shouldn't do that. Not that I think you shouldn't. And so we've got to be very careful with this. And like I said, this is only 2 verses. We're going to go a lot deeper into this, but I want you to study it on your own and dive into it on your own as well. And like I said, with all my teachings, don't just take it because I say it, that, this is what Chad studies, and Chad's going through the whole Bible, right? Looking at the whole New Testament, looking at the whole Old Testament, right? Of how things should be done, and how God looks at marriage and things he's allowed, and what is spoken to in the New Testament. And again, it's kind of hard because there's not a lot spoken about it in the New Testament. There's really 2 things that fall under there. And so, we need to be careful with this, and we need to make sure we get it right. But the one thing I want to make people understand is there's you don't find things where it's like, well, you've committed this sin, so now you're just in a constant state of this sinfulness, right? It'd be the same thing with drunkenness, right? If I get drunk one time, I'm not constantly drunk all the time. I was drunk at that one time. And I want you to look at this with a remarriage. If someone doesn't get divorced correctly or biblically, and they do remarriage, it's that initial act is the adultery, not adultery forever. And so that's what we've got to make sure we get into and understand that that can be forgiven. And it doesn't, we don't have to split up other marriages and try to put other ones back together to make it right, because that would be, again, we would then be causing someone to divorce, which God doesn't want us to do. And so I know this is hard, and I don't know, maybe I should have put a diagram up there or something. But like I said, we're going to dive into this a little bit deeper. We're going to do a study on this just by itself, because it is such a hard subject. It's a subject that affects all of us today, because in the world today, divorce is looked at as a just an easy way out, right? It's not considered, marriage in many instances today is not considered a serious thing, not considered a serious act. And so most people go into it a lot. It's like, oh, well, we'll give it a try. If it doesn't work, we'll just split up, right? But that is not how God intended marriage to be. God intended marriage to be forever. And for there to be very few things to split that marriage up. And that's what we need to make sure we focus on. Any of us who are married or are getting married or looking to get married, is that something you take very serious, and it's not something you come out of, right? It's not something you come out of lightly. It's got to be something that you've come out for very, very serious reasons. The other thing I'll add on to this is sometimes I've seen it taught that abuse, like physical abuse, or I would say even verbal abuse. Let me get it. Not he got mad and called you, or I got mad, or she got mad and called him a name. I'm talking about true, like verbal abuse, is not grounds for divorce either. And I've actually seen people tell, I've seen women be told that they have to go back to their abusive husbands, and that's not biblical, right? And if someone's teaching something like that, then you need to stay away from them, because that is not biblical at all, and that is counter to what Jesus would suggest. And do this, in my opinion, that falls under the abandonment piece. But we'll talk about that later. But I wanted to throw that in there as well, is because the church has tried hard, I think, to get this right, but in trying to do that, they've gone way too far with some of it, and put it into where we have put people in dangerous situations, because we were trying to, in many times, honestly, just keep up appearances. A lot of it has to do with keeping up appearances, and so we've got to be very careful with how we address this. And I just wanted to throw that out there as well, because we can get a bad rap for some of this stuff, because we in our dedication to trying to get scripture right, and to hold marriage to the symbol that it is, right? To hold it to what it is, sometimes we go a little bit too far, and we need to make sure we don't do that. And again, I'm not saying we take it lightly, but we got to try to get it right, and not go too far left or too far right with it, and really find the middle of what the Bible talks about, and what's just common sense, really, in a lot of it too. So again, we're going to dive deeper into this. If you have any comments, questions on this one, put them out there. If I said anything that maybe lost you, or you didn't quite understand, or you don't agree with, I mean, respectfully, put something in the comments, and ask questions about it, and we can go back and forth on it. And again, like I said, we're going to dive a lot deeper into this. We'll probably end up doing a week or two study on it, just going through marriage and divorce and looking at it and what it means. Again, as always, I appreciate y'all following along. I appreciate you, watching these videos and watching them to the end. And I appreciate you sharing them with others. And if you think this will be beneficial, please share it. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please go ahead and do so. It's because we're going to continue to do studies like this. And as always, thank you for watching.